All right, let's talk about the environment. Why do I want to talk about the environment? Well, it's probably one of the best examples we have of a true collective goods problem. When we respond to environmental issues, everyone benefits. When we don't respond to environmental issues, everyone is impacted by the negative effects. So it's something that becomes truly transnational. Every country must participate in some way in addressing environmental challenges in order for them to be properly addressed. If we're going to do anything about it, it's going to take everyone on the planet doing something about it, as opposed to just one or two countries doing something. Now, this doesn't mean that it's going to be an easy challenge to address either. One of the main problems that we have with environmentalism comes from the fact that this is a collective's good issue. If a country doesn't participate, but enough other countries do and address a problem properly, then those countries that didn't participate still benefit. It's really easy to be a free rider if you're not one of those foremost countries at the forefront of fighting some kind of environmental change. So it becomes an issue of who and what and how much needs to participate in order to truly address these kinds of issues. Now, we have made attempts over time to form what I'll refer to as environmental regimes. So these are organizations or groups of countries that want to set new norms, that want to, figure out what we need to do to help improve the environment or maintain or conserve the environment, and create those as norms that would function on an international stage. Much as we talked about with some of the different forms of law that exist, we want these to be things that countries will participate in. One of the first real efforts to do this was in 1972, when the United Nations held a conference in Stockholm that was basically guided towards trying to bring attention to environmental issues around the world. Now, that may sound a little bit surprising, as it's been several decades since that time, and we're still discussing climate change today. But this was one of the foremost examples of really trying to get a head start on these environmental issues and trying to address them from the get-go. We also now have the United Nations Environmental Program that is tasked with giving a forum to discussion on environmental issues, and also to try to monitor which countries are contributing the most to environmental problems. These are good organizations to have, and they're supplemented by some non-governmental organizations that exist as well. Things like Greenpeace, that are organizations just dedicated to trying to maintain the health of the environment to the best of their ability. All of these organizations are not opposed to the idea of development, and that's something that's really important to note. A lot of times when we think of industrialization and we think of the impacts that development has, specifically on the area of biodiversity, we think that development is then antithetical to being able to sustain the environment. Well, all of these organizations are geared towards sustainable development. So that means that, yes, we still want to develop, we still want to industrialize, we still want to improve the lives of people on this planet, but we want to do so in a way that doesn't cause permanent damage to biodiversity, that it doesn't really destroy the future basis that development will need to be established on. In other words, if we're developing, but it comes at the expense of killing the environment that keeps us alive, we're not going to be alive to continue developing in the future. So if we can do things differently, if we can develop in sustainable ways that don't threaten that biodiversity, then we'll be able to develop in a much healthier fashion. So, in 1992, the United Nations held a conference on environment and development, and essentially established a commission that would oversee development and monitor the development that was happening in countries in hopes of encouraging it to be more sustainable. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite have that effect, because like many programs of the United Nations, it lacked the enforcement component, and really didn't have any ability to force non-compliant states into any kind of sustainable development. Again, with most things in the United Nations, it takes voluntary participation in order for them to have any kind of power. Now let's take a look at a successful and a not so successful approach to policy in regards to responding to environmental issues on an international scale. The first is the more successful case, and that is the hole in the ozone layer. The depletion of the ozone, which is probably the more scientific term for it. And let's just be perfectly honest, I'm not an environmental scientist, so I'm going to try to explain these things to the best of my ability with the knowledge that I have from the political science side. But the depletion of the ozone layer was something that scientists measured as happening to a great degree as we started to measure environmental issues around the world, starting in the 1970s. Obviously, we'd had environmental concerns before that, but we really started to reach the ability to see massive global changes, like a hole in the ozone layer starting to form over Antarctica, and then a subsequent hole that started to form over the Arctic. Now, this was kind of a problem, as you can imagine. It meant that we saw an increase in the ultraviolet rays that were penetrating the Earth's atmosphere, and that potentially led to some health concerns for the human race. We don't tend to do too well when we have a little bit too much ultraviolet radiation. And we traced some of this, the depletion of the ozone layer, back to the use of a certain kind of chemical formula called chlorofluorocarbons. And so noticing that this was, pretty much one-to-one direct correlation as far as what was causing the depletion of the ozone layer, we created the Montreal Protocol. And this was an international effort to come together and encourage countries to decrease or outright ban overall their use of chlorofluorocarbons. We wanted to do this by the year 2012. So the Montreal Protocol was created in the 1980s, was really active until 1997, but wanted to create this ongoing program that would last until 2012 for the essential elimination of all chlorofluorocarbons in our atmosphere. And in doing so, it wanted to provide economic incentives for lesser developed nations as well as developed nations that would commit to this elimination of CFCs. It was largely successful. It accomplished what it set out to do. We don't have the prevalence of chlorofluorocarbons in the atmosphere today that we did then, and the ozone has actually started to heal itself. So this was a fairly successful case of an international regime being formed to address an environmental issue and to help fix it. So what happens when this doesn't work quite so well? I mean, we've known about climate change for decades. At least since 1972 in the UN Stockholm Conference, we knew about climate change then. We know that our Earth is heating up. It's heating up at a much more rapid pace than we've seen happen in the past. And we've been able to determine with a fair amount of scientific consensus that the reason it is heating up at a much faster pace is due to an increase in carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, as well as several other greenhouse gases that again help to trap some of this solar radiation in our atmosphere and heat up the air around us. It's fairly unanimous in the scientific community that this is happening. And it's fairly unanimous that humans are part, if not that most of the cause of this happening. But regardless of that cause, we need to do something about it. We need to have the same kind of transnational response to climate change that we did to the ozone layer. So why aren't we responding to these problems? Why are we watching our biodiversity be decreased? Why are we watching the polar ice caps melt and potentially threaten island nations or, countries that have cities on their coasts, which, in case you're not aware, is almost every country that has a coast. We like to build cities on the water, and this is something that threatens that very fact. We're seeing an increase in weather-related natural disasters. Look at what happened to Puerto Rico. We have plenty of evidence that climate change is happening and is affecting us as a species at this moment. Well, we made it political. And it kind of makes sense that it would become political. I mean, first of all, climate change is something that affects every nation on Earth. So of course there's going to be some kind of politics involved. But why wasn't it as simple as the depletion of the ozone layer, or at least addressing that? Well, it's much more involved economically in individual countries. We have a reliance on fossil fuels, and most specifically, the Western countries or the global North have reliance on fossil fuels. And that means that we have a vested interest in not responding to climate change. When climate change comes about and says that the outcome or the product of industrialization, the product of our use of fossil fuels, is resulting in climate change, why would we have incentive to then fight that? It also takes an extreme amount of money to even start combating this. We need to form some kind of international regime, and who's going to foot the bill for that? As we've heard from places like the United States, they certainly don't want to be the one to do it. We also are dealing with an inequitable or an unequal distribution of cost and effect when it comes to climate change. Those that are using the fossil fuels and producing the most greenhouse gases to affect climate change are the global north, and those that are being most affected by the change in climate, as we've talked about it, as they're put at a disadvantage because of all of these other circumstances, all of this inequality that already exists in the world. The ones who are most affected by climate change is the global south. So the ones who need this fixed the most, and the ones that are producing and need to do the most to fix it, are not the same people. So that doesn't mean that there haven't been efforts to try. Sure, we've had the Kyoto Protocol, which was started in 2001, updated in 2005, but it sets levels of emission standards for countries to try to abide by to decrease the overall amount of greenhouse gases that are in our atmosphere. Problem with the Kyoto Protocol is the typical problem with United Nations programs, that it just doesn't have the enforceability. It's entirely non-binding, it's entirely voluntary to participate in the Kyoto Protocol, and it doesn't have that massive support from some of the world's foremost nations, like the United States. We did not sign on to the Kyoto Protocol. And we tried to do this again with the Paris Agreement in 2015, essentially trying to rewrite the Kyoto Protocol to be more binding, to actually have a very specific scientific goal of limiting our overall temperature rise to only 2 degrees by the mid-21st century. And again, not a bad effort to do, but it requires that we have the major players in this game sign on to it. And when the United States removed itself from the Paris Agreement, it essentially undercuts any ability that this agreement has to really effectively deal with the issue of climate change. So what's ahead for our environment? Well, in addition to climate change not being resolved in any way, shape, or form and continuing to threaten our lives and the entire planet into the immediate future, all of these problems are really going to be compounded by an increase in population. And our population on a global scale shows very little sign of abating anytime soon. We're currently at around 7.5 billion people on the planet. Estimates put most of that population in developing or underdeveloped countries. And as you can imagine, those have experienced the most growth when it comes to population, especially places like India, which is currently set to overtake China as the most populous nation in the world within the next decade or so. By 2050, we're looking at potentially increasing by another billion or 2 billion people on this planet. And that really puts all of these issues into sharp contrast. When we talk about all of the inequality that exists in the world and all of the environmental issues that we face and have thus far been incapable of truly responding to in an effective way, we're facing a lot of issues that are going to get very bad in the next few decades if we don't do anything about them. So I hope you enjoyed this optimistic look at the environment and how we're dealing with it on an international scale, or not really dealing with it. We'll come back next week to talk a bit about international trade. Have a good day.